Everyone this morning for tuning in to our timely topics. The program that we've got today is one that I get lots and lots and lots and lots of questions on, and I know our speaker this morning, Lee Rumble, does as well. And so I'm very appreciative to have Mr. Lee Rumble. He is with UT TSU Extension in Knox County. His basic He's responsible for ag and also economic development, but kind of his wheelhouse is horticulture, and not only dealing with consumer horticulture, but a significant role dealing with commercial landscape companies and nursery companies. And so Lee, his background is in horticulture, obviously, but more specifically, I think the trees and woody type shrubs is kind of where he really finds his passion. And so we're very fortunate to have him here with us this morning. And I don't want to take up any more of his time, and I will turn it over to Mr. Lee Rumble to talk about those landscape trees and management practices for those. So thanks a lot, Lee.
Great, Greg. Thank you so much for having me, of course, today. I am excited to be here, and certainly, as you've already mentioned, yes, definitely passionate about woody ornamentals and trees. A little on my background, I entered the working world pretty early in life, and I kind of found my passion was actually in trees. And I started in the arboricultural industry over 2 decades ago, about 21 years ago. And I worked day in and day out, and I found that I just loved trees. I thought they were a really intriguing organism. They couldn't move, but they still coped with what they were dealt with every day, day in and day out. So I started studying a little bit, wound up getting my ISA arborist certification back in 2010. And little did I know at the time that would really just be a springboard to get me over to an associate's in hort, a bachelor's in plant and soil science, and then I would conclude my degrees with botany, master's in botany. And I was able and fortunate to even conduct my research in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But as Greg kind of already, alluded to, is my work is primarily with commercial growers, of course, residents, arborists, and landscapers throughout the Knoxville area. So with that, we'll just jump into the program. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we properly plant, select, and establish those trees in our landscape. So, we're inherently drawn to plants, right? Particularly those of us here on this call today. Thank you all for taking time out to come watch this presentation. But we're drawn to plants for different reasons. Some of us like the aesthetics, the texture, maybe the colors or smells or taste they bring into our landscape. Or you may even use horticultural plants as a form of therapy. But we also like plants because of their shape, right? The way that they actually look in the landscape. But in all seriousness, I want to talk about, when I say shape, I really talk about their habit, their growth habit, the way that they naturally look in the landscape. We know that if we properly site select our species, we can add a wonderful amount of ambiance to a yard or an entire landscape. Now, when we plant a tree in our yard, we may or may not realize it, but we're actually benefiting the urban forest as a whole. And in turn, that urban forest benefits us. Multiple lines of research have shown that urban forests promote a greater sense of well-being, right? We're happier, healthier people among the trees. But they provide ecosystem services as well. They reduce heat island effect. They help to slow water runoff. Of course, they attract wildlife. But beyond that, there's also some monetary value. They do help reduce crime rates. Studies have shown the closer you live to an urban forest, you can see actual crime rates of crime reduced in those areas. And of course, as anyone that ever gardens, that certainly mature lots can increase property value substantially compared to those newer subdivisions that may just have a small tree in the front yard. However, these benefits really only come when we're thinking long-term about what we're planting. So it really takes some initial considerations for us to consider before we just throw a tree in the ground. And, the first is, what's the goal of the planting? All too often I receive phone calls time and time again, well, what should I plant? What should I plant? What should I plant? And a lot of times that just requires a little bit of soul searching. You know, are you looking for a large shade tree, or are you looking for something ornamental? A tree that brings in wildlife or colors or textures, such as these osmanthus here. Or are you trying to block a view off? You know, these are really important questions to ask even yourself before you just plant a tree in the ground. Second, what amount of input, you know, and that may mean time if you're able to do the work, or it may mean money if you have to hire that work out. What are you willing to invest long term into that planting? How will you handle irrigation during droughts, pruning, disease pressures, and cleaning up of the debris, the fallen leaf litter that may come down? And the reason I say this is because certainly managing this mature red oak is going to be vastly different than a smaller ornamental blue cedar here. So it's important to realize what you want long-term from that plant. And then finally, you know, is that area even conducive for a plant? I'm guilty of this too. You know, we buy a plant and then we go home and we try and shoehorn it into a location where it may or may not be adequately suited. So think in terms of space. And I don't mean just above ground, I mean below ground as well. You know, roadways, power lines, any sidewalks, are there any structures, or could the fruits that fall from that tree become an issue, or leaf litter? Because it's ultimately when we put these in the wrong place, we increase our pruning intervals, and of course we thereby add stress to that plant. But it's not just soul searching, it's also the site. You know, think a little bit about the site. Are there nutrients available? pH, what kind of pH do you have? If you've got an acidic soil, we don't want an alkaline loving plant in that spot, and vice versa. Is there a lot of organic content in your soil, or is it void of any organic? Drainage, how does water move through your system? Have you done a perk test? And I'll expand on the perk test here in just a moment. And then finally, is there enough soil volume? You know, for years we've planted red maples in islands in commercial buildings, right, in the parking lot. Well, now we're finding out that there's actually a fairly simple equation that we can use to determine how well that red maple is going to do based on the amount of soil volume in these little parking lot islands. But also think about microclimates. You know, we all know of the USDA hardiness map. But there's also microclimates that may change the way that, you know, the weather actually happens here on the site. If you're planning on a berm, how's that going to react during a drought period? Certainly it's going to dry out quicker. Or is it a low-lying area that maybe has a tendency to hold water longer than normal? And we have to kind of consider these things when we're making those selections. Another thing I like to mention is what's known as phototropism, right? A tree's ability to chase sunlight. That is ultimately what our trees do. If you look at this river birch here, it's planted in the middle of downtown Knoxville. Probably not the best suited species for a concrete urban area, but certainly a tree that is thriving because it is under irrigation. But if you notice the lean that's been created by that, that simply is a response of the building casting shade on it. So think also of your neighboring trees, your neighboring plants or buildings that may reduce the amount of sunlight on one side of that plant. And then reflected sunlight, you know, how does sunlight penetrate, of course, you know, our paved areas and potentially cast or throw that sunlight on the underside of the leaves. And then finally, because so much of arboriculture is related to tree risk, you have to think in terms of what targets are in the area that would potentially be damaged if the tree were to fall. So that means above ground power lines, below ground utilities, any structures or pedestrian walkways or vehicular traffic. So keep that in mind when we're working through how do we best select a species for our yard. Now, these seem very basic at their core, but in the urban environment, you know, we often overlook this. And I'm guilty of it as well. We've all seen trees that were planted too close to structures early in life, the wrong species selected for the site, whereby we have to prune them more frequently. Trees kind of shoehorned into areas where they probably don't belong. And we love monocultures. You know, for years we have promoted monocultures. We are really pushing against that now. You know, if one single pest comes in here, arborvitae leaf miner, well, that pest now has 15 of these arborvitaes in a row to ultimately complete, what its task is. So, look for diversity. And then finally down here, even with diversity, there can be issues with that. A lot of times if a landscape architect helps you draw up plans, what looks good on paper may not look quite as good when it's actually in the landscape. So understanding those plants is really important. So, how do we choose an appropriate tree, right? So it's really personal preference, and it is professional recommendations. Communication is certainly key here. Down here, the formal gardener is probably going to want a different species than the backyard homesteader. Drive around the block. This is one of my favorite things to tell someone to do when they ask, what tree, should I plant? I like to send them around their very own neighborhood, because if there are species there that are known, that are thriving, it's likely that that species is also going to do well in your own yard. So, if you walk around and every Colorado blue spruce in the neighborhood is infected with a needle cast disease and they're dying, the bottoms are brown, they don't look good, don't consider that as an option. Find those species that are thriving. And finally, as a shout out to us as extension agents, we're in all 95 counties. I am very proud to state that I work alongside hundreds of other professionals that work to make Tennessee a better place. So no matter which county you're in, you have a local agent. You can reach out to them for assistance as well. So when is the best time to plant a tree? And I'll just warn you, it's a trick question. So when is the best time to plant a tree? Simple answer is 20 years ago. That is the reality. There's no wrong time to plant a tree necessarily. But that said, we are spring and we are fall planters. That is when the majority of our trees are going in the ground. Now in the spring, we have some advantages. Things are starting to flush out. People are excited. They're out in the yard. Nurseries are usually full of stock, and the temperatures can usually be pretty cool and wet. But the downside is sometimes when we go into these nurseries, we may only have a few number of species, because they know what sells the best and they're going to stick with those tried and true. So you may have a limited selection. A second issue that I see in the spring is a lot of times trees may have only recently been dug out of the ground, particularly bald and burlap trees. And of course, beyond that, spring trees may or may not need supplemental watering. Now in the fall, of course, we have some advantages as well. First being that plants are really preparing for dormancy. So they're not vigorously growing at this stage. They're really more preparing for the upcoming winter. Of course, photosynthates are moving from that crown down into the root structure. And these roots in the fall are actually going to continue to grow until we get down to about 45-degree soil temps. And that's important because if we're able to plant in the fall, those roots are going to grow through the fall, some into early winter. And then by spring, when we have that flush out, there is a greater root system that's better able to support that canopy. So I am a huge fan of planting in the fall. The downside to fall planting though, nurseries sometimes will be low on stock by then, or they may have what's known as carryover, stuff that has been held over since the spring. A lot of times that can lead to injuries along those main trunks. Of course, if we plant too late, there can be some winter injury. Now that's not something that typically kills a tree, but it can lead to some dieback. And of course, we have to be careful of drought. 2019, NOAA's described as a flash drought now, where we surpassed 2 drought categories in a very short time frame in October of 2019. So they can be dry months. But that said, I still am going to promote a fall planting season, and that's really that September to November time frame. Now with spring, we're planning on about Valentine's Day to Memorial Day. So end of February to end of May is roughly. Now, does that mean you can't plant outside of these windows? Absolutely not. You certainly can. It just may mean a bit more maintenance for you as you go along. And it's more important that you watch those trees over the course of the new planting timing. Now, before we plant trees in the ground, I think it's important that we understand the urban environment that we live in. We are becoming more and more urbanized every day. Urban environments are generally going to be highly fragmented. We use a limited number of species. If I asked everyone to write down 10 of their favorite species on paper, I would imagine 4 or 5 of those would overlap. We see increased soil temperatures, greater number of air and soil pollutants, and ultimately it's just a system that's, greatly influenced by people. The management that's happening in this corner lot may be different than this over across the street. And certainly that's going to be true versus the field in the background. Now, if you've ever taken a basic soils course, you've probably seen this image. This is the textbook image of a soil horizon. We've got that organic layer, the topsoil, the alluviated zones, our subsoils, parent material down to bedrock. And, this looks great on paper, but if you've ever stuck a shovel in the ground, and certainly in East or Middle Tennessee, typically the soil conditions are going to be a good bit poorer. We're often high in clay and really low in organic content. The layers don't necessarily break out as nice as they do in the textbook image. Our urban soils are often highly compacted, and this is particularly true in new housing developments where they've come in, they've taken all the topsoil off, sifted and sold the majority of that, left you with that subsoil, and then maybe they sprinkle a little bit of topsoil back on. Now, as a result of that, you can have these impervious layers or hard pans that may exist just below the soil surface. And if you see in this image, you can already see kind of water collecting here. And that's really just a zone that's not allowing that water to pass as a result of compaction from heavy machinery and time. And of course, we know urban soils can also exhibit higher soil temperatures. So if nothing else, it's safe for us to conclude that our urban soils are vastly different than our forest soils, yet we're bringing forest species into our urban world and expecting them to thrive under very different conditions. So it's important that we remember that. Now, a PERT test is something that's generally, I love recommending a PERT test. I want to know how water moves through a system before I put a tree in that ground. A PERT test is not that hard. We dig a 12-inch by 12-inch hole. We roughen those sides to eliminate any glazing. Now, if you haven't heard that term, that glazing is just when the backside of this shovel depresses those clay particles very tightly, and that can actually inhibit water and root penetration. So scratch that kind of with the backside of, just a lopper or a rake, something that can break through that glazing. And we do this PERT test generally after about a day after we've had some heavy rains. And the reason we do that at that time is because our soils are at what is known as field capacity, meaning that the gravitational water has since left the system, but that soil is still saturated. And that gives us a better representation of how water is going to move through the system once it's already at field capacity. Now you come back, fill that hole originally that you've dug, fill it with water, and then I want you to leave. Just go away for 24 hours and come back the next day after you've dug your hole. Stick your tape measure in there and refill that hole completely with water, all 12 inches, and see how long it takes for that water to move out of that planting hole. And this gives us an idea of how that water is going to move. Now, if you come back in an hour and the water's gone, you're going to have a hard time keeping anything alive there because it's going to that water's leaving too quickly. But if you come back in 24 hours and there's still 6 or 7 inches of water in that hole, we're going to have other issues as well because that's just too saturated. So this simple test can give us a really good key into which species we should select going into this. What's an ideal? About 1 inch to 2 inches per hour. So, 6 hours, you should see all that water gone. That would be a 2 inch per hour rate of infiltration. And if it takes 12 hours, that's roughly 1 inch per hour, obviously. And the reason I say do this is because this single step may change your species. If you have a wet area, you're probably going to start looking at sycamores, maybe some maples, silver maples, or river birches, some of these water-loving species, as opposed to those that are not going to tolerate wet roots. And this is really also one of the major issues that I see with monocultures is, you know, people expect the whole landscape to infiltrate water at the same place, it's the same rates, but they may not, because there may be undulations in that area. So maybe some of our monocultured species that we've used, maybe it's a Leland cypress or an arborvitae, well, maybe they'll do really well on the high ground, but in those low-lying areas, they may not do quite as well. A quick case study against monocultures. You know, I had a call recently from a lady that had purchased Cryptomeria, our Japanese cedar, really wonderful species, plastic. It does well throughout multiple soil types, but it doesn't really like wet roots. And she had already ordered the tree. She had dug 5 holes. 2 of the trees had been planted. And she got rained out that evening with 3 of the holes remaining open. So heavy rains come along. Well, she calls me the next day, and I hope you can see this second hole here. It was full of water, you know, and this is when she really realized, oh my goodness, there's a problem. The other holes had, of course, left, you know, all the water was gone from there. So I started kind of asking what disturbance happened in this area. And she said, well, sure enough, they had a heavy excavator in there years ago. The city was trying to work on a new drainage pipe, which was on the opposite side of this fence. It's since been repaired, but it's likely that this heavy equipment over time had just helped compact that soil. Maybe it sat in this area, you know, moving dirt more so than the other areas. So again, just because you want 5 pristine, perfect trees that all look the same, doesn't mean that the soil is going to allow that necessarily. Now, when we talk about healthy nursery stock, you know, that is really key. You know, I probably don't have to tell you all, you know, nursery stock comes in 3 forms here: balled and burlap, container grown, and bare root. That is how we have traditionally purchased our nursery items, and it will remain true for many more years. But no matter what you buy, it's important that you protect those new plants from the wind. So, you know, all too often I see people driving down the road with a pickup truck just full of plants that are just flying in the wind. But keep in mind, a lot of these balled and burlap trees have, again, recently been dug, so their root system is not quite established in these burlap sacks. So if we are trying to desiccate or dry those limbs out as we travel down the road through wind, the trees are going to actually transpire or lose water at a rate quicker than they can actually pick up water, because they have a reduced root system. So that's important to protect them. And you do see down in this image, they are putting a cover over this cluster of oaks. Don't lift by the tree trunk. You know, I know it's a convenient handle for you to grab, but really try not to lift from that root ball. Put the majority of the weight on the actual root ball, lift from that root ball, even if it requires a sling or a device to help with, and keep them watered. You know, again, they don't have a real well-established root system. Now, you don't have to go home and put these trees in the ground immediately, but you certainly need to keep them moist until you're able to get that tree in the ground. So what do we look for when we're purchasing nursery stock? You know, first and foremost is stuff that looks healthy, you know, free of any obvious injuries. You know, I don't want to see a tree that has a large basal cavity right out of the gate. You know, that is a problem. Look for stock that is, of course, free of diseases or pests. Now, you may not know diseases such as root rots necessarily, but if you ever pull a plant out of a pot and you see darkened, blackened, or discolored roots, that's probably a good idea for you to wander away. You know, roots should be white, they should be vigorous or cream colored, they should be vigorously growing. And I think in this little 3.5-inch block, you know, I see one little root here that may be alive, maybe one over here. But certainly, you know, you can tell a lot by looking at that root system. So look for new growth at the tip of the plant. You know, are those very, very uppermost tips actively growing? Now, be on the lookout also for what we call tipped or topped plants. This is more common in big box stores, where they'll come through and they'll snip the ends off of every single limb that's on that tree or shrub. And they do that to promote more growth. So it's known as tipping it. And it will flush out 2 new shoots. And when you come along and you think, oh, well, this is beautiful, it's full, it's vibrant. But the reality is they've just tipped the ends of those plants off. And later in life, you have to manage that. Also be on the lookout for good trunk taper. So this image with my hand in the bottom left, this is a tree that shows absolutely no trunk taper, and that's that flare at the base of the tree down to the root system. And that immediately tells me this tree is planted too deep. So I want to be careful of that as well. Look for good quality graft unions. In this image on the right, we see a graft union in that background, and it's a little wonky. It's not perfect. So I want to find graft unions that are really, really high quality and don't create major kinks or structural defects in that trunk. Of course, girdling roots, we all know about girdling roots at this point, I feel like. If you have some girdling roots, you can fight through that. You can prune those off. But if it's something to this effect or this effect, maybe look for another one. And as I've progressed through my career, another thing I'm now cautiously observing is a lack of codominant stems. And what that means is simply trees that have twin trunks, so that grow together, basically. I want to be careful of that because as those trees mature, you have to manage those twin trunks. Now, let's say we've done our soil searching. We know what kind of site we have. We know what we want to put in the ground. We bought really good nursery stock. It's time to put that tree in the ground. And this is just as important as any of the two previous steps. Now, I would argue there's two ways to plant a tree. You can dig a hole and you can put a tree in it, or you can professionally plant a tree. A lot of times we see this in the landscape. A root ball, a hole that's dug just slightly larger than that root ball, trees lifted up, set in the ground, and then it's forgotten until there's a problem. When we professionally plant a tree, we think through all of the stuff that I've just discussed, and we spend a lot of time and energy on that hole. In the words of a good friend and colleague, Dr. David Merker, spend $100 on the tree and $200 on the hole, not $200 on the tree and $100 on the hole. This will give a tree a jump start in life and allow it many, many decades in the landscape, as opposed to creating a situation where we're just barely digging a hole large enough to accommodate the root ball. So that said, I think that, trees deserve more than a planting hole. I would argue that you probably need to put trees into an established area, a planting area, if you will. And that means an area that's much wider than it is deeper. I really want to work that soil that is going to be in a large area where I know those roots can vigorously grow into. Now, most textbooks will tell you 2 to 3 times the size of the root ball. But why not go bigger than that? Up to 5 times the size of the root ball. If we've got a 20-inch root ball, that's 100 inches wide. That's a little over 8 feet. It's not uncommon to have an 8 feet bed for, a mature tree. And over time, we can expand that. Now, roughing the sides of the hole, this is a little bit less important when you're doing a planting area. In other words, a large established bed. Whereas if you're just doing a planting hole, just a simple hole, if you are doing a hole, make sure that you do score those sides so that we eliminate glazing again that I mentioned previously. And use soil amendments with caution. If you're putting a tree in a large area like this, certainly amendments are fine. You can put up to about 20% of that area in an organic content. So leaf litter, pine bark mulch, or just bark mulches. Anything that was previously living can be a really good organic matter to throw into that hole while we retain the majority of the actual native soils that were there. But what is important there is that it has to be uniformly mixed so that we get a similar soil texture throughout that entire area. A lot of times we see people just dig a simple hole, throw some sand, throw some peat in there, and then put the clay on top, or vice versa. And the problem with that is that leads us to different water infiltration levels. So, the peat's going to hold that water better, the clay's going to hold it better, and the sand's going to release that water. So we have to be careful about that. And that's why it's important to really make that a uniform soil texture. And plant properly, that's hard to show on a Zoom call, right? It depends on that root flare, and that's where that trunk meets the root system at the ground level. You know, incorrect planting depth, we see it all the time, and it leads to major issues down the life for our ornamentals, crown and rot diseases, and ultimately instability of the tree. You know, remove your tags, wires, ropes, any of the metal casing from the burlap sack and the burlap. And I know there's a point of contention there because, you know, a lot of published research will still say it's okay to leave the burlap sack on there as long as you fold it back. But, you know, all too often, I see burlap sacks that are left and trees never really escape that burlap. So it's, you know, my thought is, well, why would we not give that tree the best opportunity that it could possibly have by allowing it to not even have to fight through burlap or wires that are going to girdle those roots later in life? Let's go ahead and get those roots completely free and ready to grow out into our new planting area. And also, one thing we never think about, orient that terminal bud or the apical bud into the primary wind direction. You know, go out for a week or two before you plant and find out, where is the headstrong wind coming from? And the reason I say this is because if we put that bud into the wind, well, over time, it's going to fight against the wind, and it's going to help to self-right the tree. Whereas if we put it the opposite direction, over time, that wind's just going to continue to bend that tree over and over and over. Now, certainly a tree can compensate for that, but I really like to establish a nice central leader or a main trunk with good branching off of that. And then remember, you know, if you're planting a tree, plant it too shallow. I can fix too shallow, but if you call me and your tree's 4 inches too deep, there's very little that can be done at that point if it's a mature established tree. And remember, most stress and physiological disorders often trace back to poor planting practices. I see it day in and day out on site visits that I go on. But not all trees get planted improperly. You know, these are wonderful, stately gentlemen, if you will. Mature beech, mature red oak in an urban landscape have thrived for many years, so you can plant properly. Now, certainly I'd like to see these in larger landscape beds, but these are wonderful organisms that have the capacity to live still for decades more. And if you look at this root flare on both of these, you see that these are trees that are really well anchored to their soil. But what do we see in the landscape more often than not? Probably stuff like this. Dogwoods that are planted too deep, dogwoods that have had mulch up their bark for many years as identified by the lichen growth above where the mulch was. I started excavating this tree and come to find out it was about 6 inches too deep. You almost see the root flare forming here. Also grade changes. You know, a lot of times people are shocked when I ask, well, when did you bring soil into the property? And they're like, wait, how'd you know I brought soil in? And it's, well, because your trees now look like telephone poles. There is no root flare. You can tell dirt was pushed up against that bark. And that moisture retention and the degrading of that soil over time creates cracks and crevices and breaks through the bark through that moisture retention. And then we see wood decay fungi show up and do their job. Ultimately, it's death for a tree. I've read papers that have said as much as a 3-inch grade change on a mature oak can kill it. So when we bring in soils to reseed, we may or may not realize that we are smothering those roots on our woody ornamentals and trees. And then, of course, those that really just kind of barely put a tree in the ground, you know, the hole probably wasn't dug quite deep enough. They certainly didn't tease apart the roots that were in there. So what does that do? It just continues this encouragement of girdling roots over time. Now, I've uncovered a lot of improper planting. This was a large community that had installed about 130 of these Ulmus parvifolia tree, Chinese elm, great species. They were starting to develop these weird spots on them. They didn't know what they were. They were curious about cankers. The bark was peeling. And I went out there and was just shocked to find out that, you know, these trees were planted anywhere from 6 to 12 inches too deep. If you know me, I'm a tall guy. I'm 6'6" and lanky. And this tree was almost 12 inches down too deep. And of course, I did see some of these roots that were starting to girdle, and ultimately they were trying to make their way back up to the soil surface so that they could actually respire and breathe. So when we talk about beds and planting areas, again, I would encourage you to get away from just planting a tree in a hole. I would plant that tree in a nice established area, as I've kind of sketched out here, one that has complementary species nearby. And what that ultimately does is just allows that tree to establish itself there. Bald and burlap trees are great. They're large in size. They can be a little costly, but basically one thing I do want you to take away from this is the ANSI standards basically call for you to measure that trunk at 6 inches above the soil line. And you are looking for a 10 to 12 times the diameter of that trunk. So for a 2-inch caliper tree, I want to see a minimum of a 20-inch root ball, and preferably a 24-inch root ball. And depending on the site, and the time you have, these can be preferred options. The downside to bald and burlap is, like I mentioned previously, they may have just been recently dug. And there's plenty of research that shows anywhere from 80 to 95% of those absorbing roots can be lost when we dig that spade into the ground, leaving behind only those structure roots. So transplant shock is a reality. Bald and burlap trees are also harder to move. I see trunk injuries are very common when, landscapers or even sometimes homeowners will lean them up against the bed of the tailgate. They drive across town. Well, they've just rubbed through that bark. And that, of course, is an injury that will be permanent on the tree. And also, unique species can be harder to come by in bald and burlaps as well. Again, planting depth isn't something you talk about on a Zoom, but look really for, that root flare. I want that first primary root there right at the soil surface. If you have well-drained soils, that root ball can sit pretty flat on that soil. If you have a really poor drained soil, again, plant it a little bit high. I can fix too high. I can add in a small amount of mulch and that'll decompose over time and build into that soil. But if it goes in the ground too deep, there's very little that we can do. Now, container grown trees, they're great as well. I love a good container grown tree. The reason being is there's usually less root loss when we go to plant that tree in the ground. They've grown up, they've spent their life in a pot. Now, they're obviously easier to move. We can, put them in a car almost. They're usually going to be really symmetrical plants if that's the goal you're seeking. And with a container grown tree, you can plant it most any time of year because, again, it has a fully established root system. The downside is, they may be smaller. Again, some of those unique species may be harder to come by. And girdling roots are just a reality. They're probably going to have girdling roots. However, I can fix girdling roots before I put that plant in the ground as long as I'm aware of it going into it. So again, same thing with the container growns. Just find that dominant root that's going to be right below your root flare. Make sure that's at the soil line or right above the soil line. Tease those roots apart. And sometimes we even get fairly aggressive with container grown root systems. We'll dig through them fairly aggressively and allow them to grow. And then finally, bare root trees. I love a good bare root tree. They're small, they're easy to plant, and they're lightweight. Downside is they're small. No homeowner wants to put in a white pine tree that's the size of your pinky. But keep in mind, these are going to be trees that have full root systems. They've never lost a root system in any way, not through cutting girdling roots and not through the spading of bald and burlap. They're a little harder to keep alive. You want to keep them moist. You want to keep them in a cool environment. And sometimes it's harder to know right where to plant them. But pay attention to that in the first lateral root. Now, which one is best? So it depends on where you're at monetarily. It depends on where you're at life stage wise. And it depends on where you're at based off of just, an understanding of how plants grow. This is a great image. Everybody says an image is worth 1,000 words. And I hope this one kind of hits home the point in which should you choose. So if we look at this image, these are two separate spruce trees that were transplanted at different stages of life. The circle that you see in the center here is the size of the tree at the transplant. So this pencil mark. So on the left, we have a smaller transplanted tree, and on the right, we have a larger 2-inch caliper tree. So what do we see in the smaller transplant tree? After it was replanted, In year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we see active growth, abundant growth. But what do we see in the larger tree that was transplanted? Well, severe stunting, right? In years 1, 2, and 3. Look at the growth in year 1, almost non-existent. Year 2, it started to wake up a little bit and take a hold. Year 3, we get close. And by year 4, we're closely matching that of year 1 on the smaller transplanted. So keep in mind, transplant shock is a reality. Now, this is one species, this is spruce. I'm not saying that you can extrapolate this to every species in the world, of course. But what do we see? You know, the smaller transplanted tree after 5 years of growth is actually the bigger tree in the landscape. So which tree would you rather have in your landscape? And keep in mind, the tree on the left, probably a $100 tree. The tree on the right was probably a 2-inch caliper spruce that could have been $300 or $400. So not only did we pay more for it, it was harder to move, it was harder to install, but we wound up with a smaller tree in the landscape at the end of the ordeal. So following planting, you know, it's important that we pay attention to our new plants. You know, it is a big operation. It really is. Trees are very slow to recover from being moved from one site where they were happy and content over to a new environment. Oftentimes too, the soils on nurseries are going to be a little looser. They're going to encourage good root growth. We rip them out of there and we bring them over to East Tennessee where they go in hard packed clay. That is a reality. That is hard to recover from. We don't prune at the time of installation. We don't fertilize, and we don't use black plastic around the root zones of our trees. And really, it is watering that's going to be the key to survival after you've planted that new tree. You know, water it about every 5 to 7 days, you know, and you probably think, wow, that infrequently. And I do, you know, I would rather see a tree experience a little bit of drought than see it over flooded. And that is an issue we see a lot is, you know, trees get overwatered, that planting hole gets filled up with water. And I'll talk more on that. And then adjust according to the drainage, you know, that is important. Now, ways to water. How do we water properly? You know, we look at these 3 images, the top left one being kind of what I see the homeowners do a lot of times after a landscaper will install a tree. Again, probably the hole's not big enough, but the landscaper will say, well, you're required to water this or I can't guarantee it. So the homeowner goes out with a hose pipe, drops it at the level, turns on the water and leaves it on for 30 minutes. Well, it floods that hole, becomes anaerobic, anaerobic. No oxygen exchange happens, roots die, and the tree goes into stress. So all 3 of these, I would argue, are improper ways to water. We also don't want water spraying on our trunks. Now, I know this is not a newly planted tree, but we don't want any water. And water bags, you know, we love ease, but the reality is these water bags are putting the water in the wrong location, especially if you've just planted a hole, because they're really doing nothing different than the hose pipe example. The second reason is on some of our thin bark trees, if they grow up their whole life in shade and then we go up out of there and we pull that bag off 5 years later, 10 years later, well, suddenly that bark can actually become what's known as sun scalded, and that can create injuries or large sections of the bark will actually flake off. And third, you know, another reason is because pests. It's a great home for pests. If you've ever pulled back one of these large watering bags, you've probably seen fire ants tucked in there. They love kind of this hidden area where no rainwater is getting in. So how do we water appropriately? Well, I love the fountain style sprayers. You know, fountain head sprayers, they're going to cast about a 6 foot on either side, you know, 6 foot radius of water. About 12 foot of area is going to be watered by this. Now, if you've already got existing irrigation, there are, you know, sprinkler heads that allow for this as well. And I want that water really kind of far out. I want it out at the drip line. And what that looks like is really kind of far out away from where the original planting hole is. And if you'll notice in this next click, I'm going to show those roots. Then if you've created a large area, so if this whole area has been tilled gently, you know, those roots are really going to seek out that new water source. Whereas if we just put the water right on the trunk, we're going to just encourage more girdling roots. So staking, you know, staking is very, very rarely needed on new trees. Our city arborist has put in hundreds of trees every year. And each year I ask him how many he stakes, and it's usually less than 10 trees that actually get staked out of, 700 or 800. Staking is just not needed if you've planted the tree properly. And if we do stake a tree, it's important that we don't, of course, restrict any tree movement. There are new ways to stake trees where you don't even have to put any structure on the tree. You can actually stake the root ball. We can talk about that more later. And then the problem with staking too is, everyone says they'll come back and they'll get those devices out of the tree, but I've seen it time and time again. They always get left behind, and then we wind up girdling the trees. And remember, the stronger the breeze, the stronger the trees. Trees, just like you and I, have to exercise. If we sat down on a couch for 6 months, we would lose muscle memory. We wouldn't be able to get up and walk around. And that is an issue. Same is true for trees. They need to bend, they need to sway and create what's known as compression and reaction wood, tension wood, compression and tension wood. And ultimately, it is that exercise that helps them build to become stronger, more dominant trees in the landscape. Now, pruning is tricky. Years ago, we thought, well, it lost a lot of roots. We probably should prune the top back as well. We don't do that anymore. We want every single bit of foliage on that tree after planting. If we're taking leaves off, we're removing auxins, which are just plant hormones that instigate growth. If we over prune it at the time of planting, it can produce, tall growth, leggy growth, bushy, suckering at the base sometimes, and you can even delay bud break where the tree won't leaf out at the same time as other similar species. Now, there's exceptions to this. If you break a limb when you're planting the tree and it's clearly broken and hanging, go ahead and clip that off. If there's a cross limb or two or a dead branch, those can come off. And, as Greg's probably taught you all already, fruit trees are very different. I'm not talking about fruit trees here. I'm talking about woody ornamentals. Fruit trees get extensively managed from day one, and that includes pruning. So are you saying don't prune my tree, Lee? No, I'm not. I want to structure prune every woody ornamental that goes in the ground, but I want to wait about 2 or 3 years. And what this will do in our ornamentals is really set them off on the right foot so that they have the potential to grow for many, many decades. The goal when we're talking about pruning, and you'll notice on this right tree, a couple little highlight marks pop up. I want a nice central leader. So you remember earlier that term codominance when I said twin trunks. That's what we're seeing start to form in this sugar maple. I want to subordinate one of those limbs so that I have one nice central leader. And then I want really good scaffold branches or lateral branches. And what that means is I look for these areas of crowding or duplicates where limbs may be on top of one another. So if we take a cross section of this tree, maybe above ground, it looks something like this. If we're looking down on the tree, maybe there's some cross limbs here or duplicates here. Well, after we prune, we can create one nice tiered section at that level and then continue up the tree. I'm going to skip that slide. Now, what about mulching? So do we mulch our trees after we plant? I usually ask, are you an A-type mulcher as seen over here on the left, or are you a B-type mulcher? If you're an A-type mulcher, I'm going to tell you no, don't add any mulch. I think we all know the woes of volcano mulching at this point. This is very common. I'm not sure why it still happens so prevalently. I know people like symmetry in the landscape, but this is not how we mulch our trees. This leads to eventual plant death. You can't have the moisture retained against the bark like that. In addition to that, mulches are going to degrade over time, creating heat and breaking down organic wood products such as bark. So am I saying don't mulch? No, I want you to mulch. Mulch is critically important. I mean, it really is, especially for our woody ornamentals. You can't understate the benefits of having a high quality mulch. When you think in terms of mulch, I want you to think of the term FBI, and that's fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates. And that's ultimately the biotic system that we want beneath our trees. So they're in there degrading, they're working on that soil, they're creating new air pockets, new water channels for water to flow, and they're living, they're dying, they're respiring. So that is the biotic system that we want beneath our tree. They conserve soil moisture. Obviously, we know that they keep temperatures low. Obviously, there's no competition with grass, and they, over time, as those FBI, the fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates, as they decay, they build up the soil structure in time. But more importantly, mulch keeps people off the tree's roots. You know, there's no compaction by heavy mowers. People are less likely to park a car on there. And over time, that reduces compaction. So, you know, proper mulching is about 3 inches of mulch, you know, not anymore. It's definitely not the 20 inches we saw in the previous slide. On new trees, I really want to go about 2 to 3 times the width of that root ball. But again, if you're planting a tree into an area, I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and landscape that whole area, not just put a little donut ring around the tree trunk. Again, we're trying to encourage those roots to get away from the trunk. Now, on established trees, 5 feet beyond the drip line. And you may take a double take on that and say, wait, did he just say go 5 feet beyond the drip line with mulch? And the answer is yes. You know, I did say that, just like in the image we have here. Now, that's not realistic for everybody. I know some people in the South love grass growing all the way up to the tree trunk. But is that what the tree wants? It's not. You know, go into any natural forest setting and tell me how much grass you see growing beneath a tree. And the answer is 0. You know, you're going to see 10 inches of leaf litter, sticks, twigs, little dirt particles that wash off of that tree. And you're going to dig down through that and find mycelium from many different types of fungi. You're going to find invertebrates in there. And you just don't find that in a manicured lawn that goes all the way up to the tree trunk. Also keep in mind, roots that drink for a tree, they're out here at the drip line. They are nowhere near this tree trunk. They just are not. We seem to mulch around our trunks because it looks symmetrical. But the reality is mulch there does very little to no good at all. The absorbing roots are out here at the drip line, and even that's a little misleading because they can extend 2 to 3 times the height of the tree. So keep that in mind when you're considering long-term, how do I fix a tree or how do I help my tree most? Usually it's remove the competition and get a layer of mulch. Trees are long-lived woody organisms. They don't like anything to happen overnight. They want those slow organic processes to build up over time and slowly release nutrients back to them. Now, proper planting produces healthy urban trees. I've worked on hundreds of them. I love them. You can have very healthy specimens in the landscape, and it's not always easy. And it's not always cheap. You know, sometimes, you know, hiring an arborist is more expensive than a chuck in a truck. But usually you're going to get higher quality results when you've worked with an arborist that has many years of experience, and you often get what you pay for. You know, it's always important because, again, much of this relates to tree risk. And when we neglect those cultural requirements, you know, we run into increased pruning intervals, we damage our root systems, we have a higher cost to maintain our stock, and we get an undesired effect in the landscape. And time again, I've seen it, we get into this vicious monetary cycle where we pay to purchase and install our material, we pay over the years to maintain it, and then we pay to remove it, often starting the cycle over, sometimes even with the exact same species. And the reason all this is relevant, I've got one more slide, and is because we are constantly battling microscopic foes that we may or may not see. Certainly us as agents, we see them more commonly, more frequently, but the reality is plant pests and pathogens, they're here for the long run. They're omnipresent, they're all around us, and they're here to survive. If you remember back to 8th grade biology, 9th grade biology, you probably remember K and R selected species. You know, many of these pests are R selected species, meaning they have a huge number of offspring in a really short amount of time. They can have multiple generations within a single year. So some of our aphids, our wasps, our scales, white flies can be really problematic in the landscape. But it's also our plant pathogens. Ceridium canker, Innonatus, Hypoxylon, Ganoderma, Trametes, Kretz. These are serious plant pathogens and wood decayers that capitalize on any injury in a tree. So that's why it is important that our trees be left alone, aside from that very minor structure pruning at about year 2 or year 3 then we don't predispose that tree to other wood decaying fungi. And finally, we expedite the survival of these plant pests a lot of times because we use a very limited number of species. We sell plants that are vulnerable a lot of times to these pathogens. We love to landscape in monocultures. If nothing else today, please, I want to promote diversity, especially rather than in evergreen plantings. Let's stop planting one single species and 15 of them in a row. That is just a problem in the landscape. And then ultimately we ignore the requirement of the plant. Remember, our plants are usually cultivars of some forest species. They've been bred, but we originated these from forest organisms, and then we bring them into an urban world and we hope and expect them to thrive. And that's not always the case. So my goal is, of course, to tell people, try and mimic what you would see in a natural forest system. How often do we see dogwood trees planted out in full sun? All the time, everywhere. And they're usually stressed, they're usually sickly, they're wilting by the end of the day, they're prone to borers. And then where do we see a dogwood in a natural landscape? Underneath the canopy of mature hardwood trees. So keep that in mind, plant appropriately. And with that, I think I'm going to conclude, Greg. I think I'm at 55 minutes. I hope that wasn't too long. I've got my contact number. And thank you all for having me. I'll be happy to sit here and take questions. So,
First off, Lee, exceptional